The elevator doors closed on Fiona Marsh at exactly 8:51 in the morning, and the man inside looked directly at her through the glass panel, pressed the button anyway, and let the doors slide shut. She stood there for a second, staring at the polished metal where his reflection had been. "Okay," she said to nobody. "Okay." That happened. The next elevator was on the 12th floor. The interview was at 9. The architecture firm of Mercer and Caldwell occupied the 18th floor of a building in downtown Vancouver that had no fewer than 4 banks of elevators, which under normal circumstances would have seemed like an abundance of options, and under these circumstances felt like a personal joke from the universe. Fiona took the stairs. She took them at the pace of someone who had been doing something athletic recently, which she had not, and by floor 7 she was having what she could only describe as a spiritual crisis in a stairwell. Her portfolio folder was tucked under one arm. 12 printed copies of her landscape architecture resume were in her bag, and one of her heels had developed a sound, a clicking sound, rhythmic, loud, the kind that announced a person's presence 3 corners before they arrived. She pushed through the door to the 18th floor at 8:59 and stopped at the reception desk with the controlled breathing of someone pretending they had not just climbed 11 floors. "Fiona Marsh," she said. "I have a 9 o'clock. The receptionist, a young man with a clipboard and the kind of calm that comes from never having taken a stairwell in shoes, looked up. "Mrs. Marsh, of course." He paused, glancing at something on his screen. "Mr. Calloway's running a few minutes behind, actually. You can take a seat." Fiona took a seat. She sat very still and let her calves stop burning in private. The waiting area outside Mercer and Caldwell's main offices was the kind of space that made a person feel immediately underdressed, regardless of what they were wearing. Exposed concrete, low leather chairs, architectural models under glass. One wall was entirely windows looking out over Burrard Inlet, which was doing that thing it did on clear October mornings where the mountains looked painted on. Fiona looked at the mountains for exactly 4 seconds before her phone buzzed. Her neighbor, Mrs. Tree, and entirely unimpressed by digital communication but had recently learned to text for emergencies. Theo spilled his words. "Not milk. I think paint." Fiona typed back, "Is he okay, Mrs. Chung?" "He is proud." "Fiona, on what surface?" "Mrs. Chung, we are discussing." Fiona locked her phone and stared at the mountains again. Theo was 6. In the 8 months since her divorce had been finalized and she had moved them both into a 2-bedroom apartment on Cambie Street, he had painted the bathroom door frame with watercolors, attempted to train a crow in the courtyard, and once disassembled a kitchen chair to, in his words, see how it thought about gravity. He was the most interesting person Fiona had ever met, and he was also the reason her bank account currently contained $412 after rent. She had been rejected by 11 landscape architecture firms in 9 months. 11. She had a master's degree and 6 years of experience at a firm in Edmonton that had closed when the senior partner retired without warning. She had excellent references. She had a portfolio she was actually proud of. And she had, apparently, become very skilled at receiving polite emails that said things like, "We've decided to move in a different direction," while sitting in the parking lot of Theo's school so he wouldn't see her face. Mercer and Caldwell had called on a Tuesday. She had replayed the voicemail 3 times standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store. "Ms. Marsh?" A woman with a tablet appeared. "You can head down the hall to the second waiting area. Mr. Calloway's just finishing a call." Fiona gathered her bag and her clicking heel and followed. She was halfway down the hall when she heard it. A child crying. Not loudly. The particular muffled kind of crying that happens when someone is trying very hard not to, which is somehow worse. It was coming from a small alcove near the elevator bank, one of those transitional spaces that nobody designs on purpose, with a bench and a dying plant and a fire extinguisher. A girl was sitting on the bench, 8, maybe 9 years old. Dark coat, dark hair, both hands pressed flat against her thighs the way children do when they're trying to hold themselves together. She was staring at the floor and her shoulders were shaking. The hall was not empty. 2 people walked past her on their way somewhere important. Neither of them stopped. Fiona stopped. "Hey," she said, crouching down. "Hey, are you okay?" The girl looked up. Her eyes were red and her chin was doing that unsteady thing that meant the tears were not finished. "I can't find my dad," she said. The words came out careful, like she'd been practicing keeping her voice level. "We were in the lobby, and he had to sign in at the desk, and I came up to find the washroom, and now I don't know where he is, and I don't have a phone." "Okay?" Fiona kept her voice even. "That's a fixable problem." "What's his name?" "James Calloway." Fiona blinked. Something moved in the back of her brain. She filed it away immediately because there were probably 40 Callaways in Vancouver and the important thing right now was this child. Can you describe him? What's he wearing? Gray jacket, he's tall. The girl paused. He has a coffee cup. He always has a coffee cup. Mom used to say he was surgically attached. Good detail. Fiona smiled at her. I'm Fiona. What's your name? Isla. I work in buildings, so I know a trick. When you get separated, the best thing is to go back to the last place you were both together, because that's usually where the other person goes to look. Does that make sense? Isla considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she nodded. Okay. Let's go to the lobby. They took the elevator. Fiona watched the floor numbers descend and did not think about the fact that she was now definitely late, that there was a woman with a tablet waiting for her somewhere on the 18th floor, that this was the last firm on her list. She thought about Isla's hands flat on her thighs. She thought about Theo, about what it would feel like to turn around and not see him there. The lobby was large and bright. There was a man near the main desk, gray jacket, coffee cup, already moving before the elevator doors were fully open. Isla, his voice came out as something between relief and barely held together. He crossed the lobby in about 4 steps and crouched down and pulled her into him, and the coffee cup went sideways and he didn't notice and didn't care. He held her the way Fiona held Theo when he'd had a bad dream, like the holding itself was the point. I'm sorry, Dad, Isla said, muffled against his shoulder. I just wanted to find the washroom. I know, sweetheart, I know. We'll get you a phone. His voice had dropped to the register people use when they want to sound calm and mostly succeed. I'm getting you a phone this week. He straightened up. He was tall. Isla had been right about that, with the particular look of someone who had been managing a lot of things for a long time and had gotten good at making it seem effortless. He looked at Fiona, and his eyes were the kind of dark green that made a person think of forests in November. She was upstairs, Fiona said, near the elevator bank. You found her. She found me, technically. I just walked her down. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Something in his expression shifted. Thank you, he said, genuine. Not the reflexive kind, I can't. Thank you. It's nothing, Fiona said and meant it, and picked up her bag and turned back toward the elevators before her brain caught up with her mouth. She made it to the 18th floor at 9:14. The woman with the tablet was still there. She looked up. Fiona straightened her jacket. I'm so sorry, Fiona said. There was a situation in the lobby I can explain. Mr. Calloway just called up, the woman said, and her voice had gone a little strange. He's on his way, he said to ask you to wait. Fiona stood very still. He's on his way, she repeated. Yes. Fiona sat down in the nearest chair and looked at the mountains again. Right, she said quietly to no one. Of course he is. James Calloway walked in 12 minutes later, coffee cup replaced, tie straightened. He stopped when he saw her. Fiona watched his expression do a very quick calculation. Ms. Marsh, he said. Mr. Calloway, she said. I should clarify something, he said, still standing. I didn't know you were the candidate when I was in the lobby. My assistant didn't tell me your name. I would have said something. I didn't know you were the interviewer, Fiona said. Your daughter just told me her dad's name. Right, he cleared his throat. He gestured toward the hall. Shall we? The office was what she would have expected. Drawings on the walls, models on a credenza, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of plants that suggested someone actually cared about the space. James sat across from her and opened a folder and then set it aside and looked at her directly, which she appreciated. Why landscape architecture, he said. It wasn't quite a question, because everyone remembers how a building looks, Fiona said. Nobody remembers how a building feels until the landscape gets it wrong. Then they remember immediately. A pause. Go on. I spent 3 years on a hospital project in Edmonton. The building itself was beautiful. The outdoor spaces were an afterthought. Concrete paths, a few benches, some ornamental grass that died every winter. Patients used it once and didn't go back. We went in and redesigned it as my firm's last project. Within 8 weeks of reopening the outdoor areas, patient use went up 60%. She opened her portfolio. That's not a coincidence. That's design doing what it's supposed to do. James turned the pages without rushing. He had the focused quiet of someone who was actually looking, not performing looking. And what brought you to Vancouver? He asked. Personal circumstances, she said. I have a son. His grandparents are here. It made sense. He nodded, and something in the slight shift of his posture told her he understood the category of answer she'd just given, the kind that means there's more, and it's not relevant here. I'll be honest with you, he said, closing the portfolio. We have 6 strong candidates for this position. I've been in practice for 15 years, and I know what an impressive resume looks like. Yours is impressive. He paused. But so are the others. Fiona nodded. "What I can't assess from a resume," he said, "is judgment." "My judgment this morning was arguably questionable," she said. "I climbed 11 floors in heels." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. "I'm aware," he said. "I also watched you talk to my daughter. She doesn't warm up to people quickly." He looked at her steadily. "She hasn't since her mother died 2 years ago." The room was quiet. Fiona did not look away. "I'm sorry," she said. "For real. Thank you." He let the silence sit for one moment before continuing. "What you did this morning, stopping when you didn't have to, when you were already late when it would have been entirely reasonable to keep walking, that tells me something a portfolio can't." "I have a 6-year-old, she said. "I couldn't walk past her. Most people did." She had nothing to say to that because it was true. James stood and extended his hand. "Second meeting Friday, 9 o'clock. I'd like you to walk the Riverside Community Park project with me. It's a public-private development, complicated site, and I want to see how you think on your feet." She shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go first. "I'll be there," she said. "I'll even take the elevator." This time he actually smiled. Friday, Fiona was standing outside the Riverside site on the North Shore at 8:47. She had a thermos of coffee, her site notebook, and both shoes making normal sounds. James arrived at 8:52 with Isla and a woman about 60 who introduced herself as Barb, his site manager, and who shook Fiona's hand with the particular energy of someone who had personally built 3 things with her bare hands and was moderately suspicious of everyone until proven otherwise. "Isla has no school today," James said by way of explanation. "Teacher Professional Development Day." He glanced at his daughter. "She's been on every site visit I've taken this month. I take notes," Isla said, holding up a small spiral notebook. "She does," Barb confirmed in the tone of someone who had checked. They walked the site for 2 hours. It was a complicated piece of land, a former industrial strip running along the water, contaminated soil in the eastern section, a heritage building that couldn't be touched, a community stakeholder group that had approximately 40 opinions about what the park should be, and 19 of them were incompatible. Fiona listened to Barb walk through the history of the file. She asked questions. She crouched down at the edge of the contaminated zone and looked at the soil and asked about remediation timelines. At some point, she became aware that James had stopped talking and was mostly watching her. "The heritage building's the key," she said, standing up. "Everyone's treating it like a constraint. It should be the anchor. If you design the pathway system to terminate there instead of passing through, you shift it from obstacle to destination. The contaminated section becomes the native meadow restoration. You're turning liability into ecological feature." She looked at the water. "And the eastern edge, right along there, that's where you put the children's zone. Low intervention, natural materials, line of sight to the main gathering area." Barb crossed her arms. "That's approximately what I've been saying for 8 months. "Then you're right," Fiona said. Barb looked at James. James looked at Fiona. "Lunch?" he said. They ate at a place near the water where Isla ordered the grilled cheese with complete confidence and negotiated a side of pickles that had not been on the menu. Fiona, who recognized the energy, watched with the quiet solidarity of a fellow parent. "She talks about you," Isla announced unprompted to Fiona. Fiona looked at her. "Sorry? Dad, he talked about you at dinner, twice." Isla examined her pickle. "He said you were smart." James set his coffee down with great care. "That was a private conversation. Mrs. Kowalski says there's no such thing as a private conversation with children in the house." "Who is Mrs. Kowalski?" "My teacher. She's very wise." Fiona pressed her lips together and looked out at the water. "He also said you climbed 11 floors, Isla added, "because the elevator left without you, and that was characteristic." She used air quotes. "I looked it up. It means it's typical of someone." "So that's good, I think, Isla," James said with the particular pronunciation of a parent who is 10 seconds from changing the subject. "I'm just reporting," Isla said, and ate her pickle. The job offer came the following Monday in a 3-paragraph email that Fiona read while standing at the kitchen counter before Theo woke up. She read it twice. She made coffee. She read it a third time. She typed back, "Thank you, I accept." She then sat down on the kitchen floor, which was cold and needed cleaning, and cried for approximately 4 minutes. The relieved kind. The kind that comes out of nowhere once the permission arrives. Theo found her there when he came downstairs in his dinosaur socks. "Mom," he said, "why are you on the floor?" "Good news," she said. He considered this. "About the job?" "About the job." He sat down next to her on the cold kitchen floor without being asked. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Then he said, "Are we going to be okay now?" Fiona looked at her son, 6 years old, gap-toothed dinosaur socks, sitting on it needed cleaning at 7:15 in the morning, asking the question that she had been asking herself for 8 months. We're going to be okay, she said. He nodded, satisfied, and got up to look for cereal. Her first week at Mercer and Caldwell was dense in the way that first weeks at firms always were: new software, new filing systems, learning where the good coffee was versus where the coffee was that people made when they didn't care. She met the senior associates, the project managers, the junior staff who had the haunted look of people doing good work on not enough sleep. Everyone was reasonably pleasant. The work was interesting. The Riverside file landed on her desk on day 3, and she stayed until 7 reading through it. She barely saw James except in passing, which was fine. He was her employer. That was the correct configuration of this situation. On Thursday, a man knocked on her office door at 11 in the morning. Mid-40s, expensive jacket, the kind of smile that takes a moment to calculate. "Fiona Marsh," he said, as if he already knew her. "I'm Griffin Hale, corporate development." He stepped in without being invited and looked around her office with the manner of someone assessing inventory. "I run the business side of things here. Strategic partnerships, investor relations, that kind of thing." He smiled. "James mentioned you were exceptional. I like to meet exceptional people early." "That's kind," Fiona said. "The Riverside project is a big file, lot of moving parts." Griffin set his hands in his pockets. "I have some thoughts on the design direction. James is brilliant, but he can get attached to the conceptual stuff. Sometimes the practical realities of stakeholder buy-in require a different approach." "What kind of different approach?" "Flexibility on the heritage building question, mainly. The client has some concerns about the designation, whether it complicates the development timeline. I think there's a conversation to be had about options." He shrugged. "I'd love to know your read on it. Off the record." Fiona looked at him steadily. "The heritage designation is what makes the project fundable from a provincial grant perspective. Removing it saves maybe 4 months on approvals and loses about $800,000 in heritage fund contributions." She kept her voice even. "I'm happy to put that in writing in a memo to the full team." Griffin's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "No need for that. Just a conversation." "Of course," Fiona said pleasantly. "My door's open." He left. She wrote down the conversation verbatim in her notebook, dated it, and put the notebook in her bag. 2 weeks later, James stopped by her office door with his jacket still on and a familiar coffee cup in hand. "The Riverside stakeholder meeting is tonight. 7 o'clock at the North Shore Community Center. You should come. I have a childcare situation on Thursday evenings," she said. "My regular babysitter takes a class." "Bring him," James said. "There's a room off the main hall. I bring Isla when I have to. She's better at talking to the elderly residents than I am, frankly." Fiona looked at him. "You want me to bring my 6-year-old to a stakeholder consultation?" "I want you at the stakeholder consultation," he said. "Bring whatever you need to make that work." She did. Theo sat in the side room with Isla, 2 notebooks, 3 markers, and a documentary about volcanoes that Isla had apparently seen 6 times and considered foundational. Fiona heard them through the open door periodically, Isla explaining tephra, fallout, Theo asking whether a person could technically outrun lava if they had good shoes. Isla said it depended heavily on the type of lava. Theo said that was a reasonable caveat. The stakeholder meeting was, as predicted, complicated. The heritage advocates were at the table. The parents group was at the table. The environmental coalition was at the table. A man named Gerald had opinions about the proposed path width that he was not prepared to abbreviate. Fiona presented the design concept for the Eastern Children's Zone. She had brought drawings scaled and clean. She walked the room through the sightline rationale, the materials philosophy, the way the native plantings would establish over 3 seasons. An older woman in the second row, who had not looked particularly engaged until that point, leaned forward. "My grandchildren will use this park," the woman said. "Will they be able to find their way around it? My youngest has some mobility challenges." "Yes," Fiona said and turned to the relevant page. "Every pathway meets accessibility standards and the secondary routes are all connected. You could navigate the full site from 3 different starting points without doubling back." The woman nodded and sat back. On the drive home, James had offered, since they lived in the same general direction, and both children were, by 9 o'clock, running on fumes. Theo and Isla fell asleep in the back seat, Theo's head against the window, Isla's head against Theo's shoulder, in the way that children arrange themselves without self-consciousness. Fiona looked at the road. "Gerald had a lot of thoughts about the path width," she said. "Gerald always has a lot of thoughts about the path width," James said. "He has been to every community meeting about this park for 4 years. He will outlast us all." "What's his actual concern?" James was quiet for a moment. His wife had a mobility issue in her last years. She used the old path that was there before. It was wider. He kept his eyes on the road. He just doesn't want the new one to feel different. Fiona looked out the window. I can widen the main loop by 1/2 meter without touching the budget. James glanced at her. You don't have to do that. I know, she said. I want to. They drove in quiet for a while. The city moved past in the way it does at night, lit and rearranged into something softer than its daytime version. Griffin Hale came to my office 2 weeks ago, she said. He wanted to talk about the heritage designation. Off the record. James's hands shifted slightly on the wheel. What did he say? He floated the idea of removing it. Said the client had concerns about the development timeline. She paused. I told him the numbers on why that doesn't make sense and said I'd be happy to put it in a memo to the full team. He declined. A moment passed. I should tell you, James said, that Griffin has been angling for a partnership stake in this firm for 3 years. He doesn't have one. He's made a project of managing perceptions around my decisions. I see, Fiona said. He's going to continue, James. It's useful to know I'm not going anywhere, she said, and I keep good notes. James looked at her briefly. Something in the way he looked at her was different from the way he'd looked at her in interviews or on site or in meetings. Quieter. I know, he said. The car was very still for a moment despite moving. Isla likes Theo, he said after a beat. Theo thinks she's the smartest person he's ever met, Fiona said. He told her that directly, which, he's never told me that, and I have a master's degree. James laughed. A real one, the kind that was clearly not a regular occurrence because it transformed his whole face for a second. And then he composed himself and it was gone, but the trace of it stayed. She hasn't laughed like that in a long time, he said, and he meant Isla. And they both knew what he meant by a long time. I know, Fiona said quietly. He pulled up to her building. Theo did not wake up for the transfer from car to lobby to elevator, which at this point was a skill Fiona had developed entirely out of necessity, the art of moving a sleeping child without triggering consciousness. Friday, James said before she closed the car door. There's a public talk at the Vancouver Public Library, Urban Ecology. It's actually good. Isla is desperate to go. He paused. I thought maybe both kids. If you don't have plans. Both kids, Fiona said, and presumably the people responsible for them. She held the car door for 1 second. I'll check with Theo. What will he say? He'll say yes if there are volcanoes involved. Urban ecology doesn't typically. I could look into it. I'm kidding, she said. He'll say yes. She closed the door. She carried Theo upstairs. She put him down in his bed with his shoes still on because some battles were for another day, and she sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and listened to him breathe. $412. 11 rejections, 11 flights of stairs, and one 8-year-old girl crying on a bench in a hallway that no one else had stopped in. Fiona stayed there for a long moment. Then she got up, and she went to make tea, and outside the window the city was still going, indifferent and bright and full of things that hadn't happened yet. The Griffin situation, as it turned out, had a longer tail than one office conversation. 3 weeks into the job, Fiona arrived at her desk to find an email forwarded from a client contact. A version of the Riverside Heritage Analysis that had her name on it but different numbers. Conclusions she hadn't written, recommendations she hadn't made. Attached to a message to the client flagging preliminary concerns about the current design direction. She read it twice. She printed it. She opened her notebook and found the notes from the day Griffin had come to her office. She walked to James's office and knocked. He was on a call. He held up one finger. She waited. He ended the call and looked at her. She put the email on his desk without saying anything. He read it. She watched his face go through several things in a short period of time. Sit down, he said. She sat. This went to the client this morning, he said. I know. I have the original analysis on my hard drive with the creation timestamp. I have my notes from the conversation with Griffin 3 weeks ago. I also sent myself the original as an email the day I finished it, which timestamps the file externally. James looked at her. You anticipated this. I suspected something like this. I didn't know what shape it would take. He was quiet for a moment. Not the processing kind of quiet, the deciding kind. I need you to send me all of that documentation, he said. The original file, the email, your notes, already drafted, she said, and handed him a printed copy of the note she'd written on the way to his office. He read it. He set it down. Griffin has been at this firm for 7 years, he said. He's good at his job within the scope of what his job is supposed to be. He looked at the email again. This is outside the scope. I know, she said. I want you to know that I'm going to deal with this properly, and I want you to know that this has no bearing on your position here. I know that too, she said. I just wanted you to have the information. He stood up and walked to the window. He stood there for a moment, and Fiona had the sense of someone organizing themselves against something they'd been half expecting. Griffin made a comment to me last week, he said without turning. About you and the Riverside file, about how much time we'd been spending on the project together. He turned around. He implied it was affecting my judgment. Fiona held his gaze. Is it? James was very still for a moment. No, he said. The stakeholder meeting alone. Gerald called me the next day to say it was the best presentation he'd seen in 4 years of community consultations. He paused. But I want to be honest with you, because you've been honest with me since the first day. Okay, she said. He was quiet for a moment, the kind that cost something. I haven't been particularly interested in the future in 2 years, he said. Not in the personal sense. I've been getting through, which is different. He looked at her directly. That's changing. And I'd rather tell you plainly than have you hear something garbled from Griffin or anyone else. The office was very quiet. Through the window, a ferry was crossing the inlet in slow motion. I have a 6-year-old and a very small apartment, and most of my energy has gone toward keeping things stable, Fiona said carefully. I haven't been thinking about the future much either, I know. But I think, she said, that things that are worth doing are usually complicated. James looked at her for a long moment. That's a very careful way of saying yes. I'm a careful person, she said. Usually. You climbed 11 floors? That was circumstantial. He almost smiled. Griffin's going to be managed. I'll handle it this week properly with HR and the senior partner. He sat back down. And the library talk is still on Friday if Theo's still interested. He spent 20 minutes on Wednesday telling his grandmother about urban meadow restoration, Fiona said. He's interested. The Friday talk ran long in the good way. The way talks do when the speaker is genuinely enthusiastic and the audience keeps asking questions. Theo and Isla sat in the row ahead with their notebooks. Isla's organized in colored sections, Theo's a riot of arrows and underlines, and 2 drawings of what appeared to be a meadow populated by dinosaurs. And they both fell asleep on the drive home before they'd made it over the bridge. James and Fiona sat in the parking lot for a moment after he stopped the car, the children asleep in the back, the city quiet. The meadow section, she said. The speaker was right about the seed mix. I've been thinking about the Riverside eastern edge, and I think we go higher native grass ratio than the current plan shows. I thought the same thing during the Q&A. Barb is going to say she told us so. Barb tells us so about something every week. She's usually right. Fiona laughed. Quietly, because of the children. James was watching her in the way he'd been doing more often lately, the direct kind, the one that didn't pretend to be looking somewhere else. James, she said. Yes, Friday dinners, she said. At whoever's place makes sense. The kids should eat together and… She paused. Whatever else. He was quiet for a moment, he repeated. I'm being careful, she said. I know. His voice was even, but his expression had done something she hadn't seen it do before. Opened somehow. I can do careful. She looked at him for a long moment. The fairy lights were moving on the water in the distance. Behind them, Isla had shifted in her sleep, and Theo had not moved at all, the way he never did once he was out. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She carried Theo up to the apartment and put him in bed, shoes off this time, and stood at the window with her tea going cold. Her phone buzzed. James, he okay? She typed back, out cold. Isla? James, same. She's smiling in her sleep. Fiona set the phone down. Outside, Vancouver was doing its usual thing, mountains, water, the slow lights of the North Shore. The same view she'd looked at on bad nights from this same window when the rejection emails came in, when she'd sit with Theo asleep and the quiet too loud and try to believe that things would eventually break differently. She looked at it now, and it looked like the same city, and also entirely different. The way places do when the person standing in front of them has changed. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She went to bed. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she didn't lie awake going through the list of everything that needed fixing. She just closed her eyes, and the room was quiet, and somewhere across the water Isla was smiling in her sleep, and Theo had his shoes off, and tomorrow had not happened yet and was therefore still full of things that might go well.